Hi, guys. So, I've got a treat for you today. I'll be interviewing one of the most knowledgeable audio engineers I know. So, Drew is a professional mixing and mastering engineer with extensive experience in the industry. He collaborates with leading audio brands like Audaz, Apogee, Sonarworks, Sonable, loads of others. Drew is also the mastermind behind Warp Academy, where he provides valuable insights and education on his YouTube channel. So I strongly going to check out the channel because there's loads of great content. So welcome, Drew. How are you doing today?
Right on. Thanks so much, Tom. I'm doing great, man. I'm eager for the interview. Thanks so much for hosting this, and we always have great chats. So I'm looking forward to this one.
Great. So we're going to dive straight in, and we're going to the things we're going to learn today from Drew. Uh, how loud should we master? Looking at a mastering stress test, and then diving into oversampling and true peaks. So we're going to start with this one. So, Drew, when do differences in loudness get noticed?
Yeah, this is a great question, and it's been the subject of a lot of research. I really love research. I have a science background. I did before I did my business degree. I did part of a science degree in university. So I'm always into the research and looking at studies. And so I really stay up to date on what's happening in the journals. One of the biggest ones is JAES, the Journal of the Audio Engineering Society.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you can just notice a difference, they call it a JND, the just noticeable difference. And that can apply to things like noticing a noise floor. It can apply to things like noticing the amount of reverberation in a space and when that reverberation decays. And it definitely applies to loudness. And so the JND for music or tones or speech is actually all different. So it can be as little as 0.2 decibels.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they call the just noticeable difference. But it does, as with almost anything related to audio, it gets caveated by an it depends. So the just noticeable difference for music is a little bit different than the just noticeable difference for white noise, which is different from the JND for pink noise, which is different from the JND for a transient or an impulse.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it can be as little as 0.2 decibels or LUFS.
Interesting. So now it brings us on to the question of why is it then important to submit a competitively loud master when you're submitting your tracks to labels? Is it important? Is it not important? Based on what you just said, it sounds like it probably is important.
It is, and where possible throughout the interview, I will refer to some videos that I've done on these subjects. So this exact question caused me to do my own research into loudness, and I published a video a little while back called "Loudness Trumps Everything," and it's not a clickbait title because it sounds like a clickbait title, but it's not, because it's actually the name of an audio engineering paper. Um, from back in the late 90s, I believe, when CDs had come out, and it was really common to see big jumps in loudness. It was kind of the beginnings, or maybe the continuation, of the loudness wars. And it became a really focal subject of how do we create a consistent music listening experience. So in an ideal world, we would be listening to everything at the same level of loudness, and we'd have this really consistent listening experience. That's kind of what radio stations sought to achieve by using compressors on music to try and even out the playback levels. And it's kind of what Spotify and Apple Music and all the DSPs are seeking to achieve with loudness normalization of songs. But in terms of how loud should you orient your music if you're submitting to a record label, it's a bit different. There's other considerations at play here. And the big one is that person who's going to be listening and evaluating your music going to be using some form of loudness normalization? And in an ideal world, they would. I'd love it if everybody was trained on psychoacoustics and understood that the ear. Well, here's a big concept to establish. I'm not going to just assume that everybody knows this to be true. But when you have something that is within that JND difference, so if it's noticeably louder, and it can be, again, as little as 0.2 dB, if a song or an element in a mix is the JND louder, the ear is going to perceive it as higher quality, as better. It's going to prefer it. We're addicted to loudness, so to speak. we will almost always prefer the louder signal. And you and I, as engineers, know this. We have to be careful not to fool our ears when processing audio. If we're processing a drum bus, say, with saturation, and that saturation plugin is adding gain or adding perceived loudness, and we're not loudness matching it, then we're always going to think the processed version sounds better when in fact it could actually sound worse. And when you loudness match them perfectly, then you get an apples to apples comparison and you can evaluate the music or your mixing move correctly. But A&R at a label is not going to do this. A&R at a label is probably going to stream your song from a SoundCloud player or a YouTube player or a Dropbox link that you send them. They're probably going to click it and stream it, is probably what they're going to do. And if they don't, they're going to download it and they're going to play it in a DAW. They're going to line it up probably against other submissions or other releases on their label. And they're going to be listening in an environment where there is no loudness normalization. They're just going to listen back to back to back. And in this video that I did called Loudness Trumps Everything, I discussed this process and talked about the research and the psychoacoustics principles at play here. So basically, you know, when you're submitting music to a label and you know that it's going to be a person in A&R who probably isn't a mix engineer or a mastering engineer, they're a business person at the label. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. They're going to get biased. They're going to make an assumption. They're going to make a critical evaluation about the quality of your song or whether they want to release it. And it's going to be based on very little information. It's going to be based on a first impression of usually them skipping ahead into the chorus of the song or listening to the first little bit of the song. You know, in my Loudness Trumps Everything video, I showed submitting to one of the world's largest, most coveted labels to be on, Monstercat. And you can't even upload more than 30 seconds of your song to them. You have to choose a 30-second clip, or maybe it might even be 20 seconds, a very short clip of the song, and that's what they evaluate your song on.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So how does that then relate to loudness? So we're saying that when you're uploading your music to these people that are going to listen just to a snippet of it, it's so important that if your music is not as loud as some of the other tracks on there, even if perhaps it sounds, you know, more dynamic or even cleaner sounding, will the louder tracks that are hitting super loud, like let's say -5 LUFS short term, that goes above, let's say, an average of -6 LUFS short term max that are uploaded to Spotify and the rest of them, when you start going above -5, there are these, you know, distortion and artifacts that can be introduced at that level, particularly if the mix isn't good enough. So will a mix that's, say, 2 or 3 decibels quieter than those mixes still sound worse, even though they're cleaner? Can you clear that one up for me?
Yeah, totally. So the big question is, do you just push as loud as, like, where's the limit of loudness and how far do you push things? And is the fact that the ear can be fooled by a small JND increase in loudness, is that enough justification to try and push your mix louder in the mastering phase? And I am not just a blanket advocate of loudness. I do the approach of what's called submit to reality. It's like, you need to understand the reality of the situation, not living in a dream world of this would be the ideal, but what people actually do. You need to have a really solid handle on reality. And then you need to understand what happens, like you said, as you push a mix louder and louder into a mastering chain. And everything varies depending on genre. Everything varies depending on the quality of the mix. You can have, you know, drum and bass, for example, is very common to be -4 or -5 LUFS integrated in the drops. Probably a little higher than that in peak short-term LUFS, which is insanely loud. In some genres of electronic music, as people have been responding to these videos on my YouTube channel, some people are saying, I go to -2 or I go to -1. First of all, let me say that I think I've never once heard anything in that level of loudness that doesn't sound like complete rubbish. Rubbish. That's just because, well, this will probably come later in our talk, but how loud do you go? Some genres are not as concerned with loudness. Like I've just done a couple of masters for a friend of mine who is a singer-songwriter. It's guitars and primarily acoustic drum kits and bass and singing and things like that. And I'm doing that stuff still louder than Spotify would recommend. I don't subscribe to the -14 LUFS thing. I'm pushing it as loud as I think it needs to go to sound good, while still retaining total clarity. So it's stuff that I'm doing in that realm is like -11. But when we're talking about electronic music for DJ play, where stuff is going to be played on a wave file on a CDJ, and there's no loudness normalization, these are going to be in DJ sets, then there is a justification to go loud, but to retain clarity. So yeah, you get to a point with every mix, and it really does depend on the genre, and in particular, even in the same genre, like drum and bass to drum and bass track, how the mix was done. And there's really intricate and detailed and complex mix techniques that when they're done, they could allow you to take a song that would normally be breaking apart at like -6 LUFS and maybe push it louder, or a song that would break apart and have distortion and aliasing and artifacts pumping at -8 LUFS and push it to -6. You know, in one of my videos recently talking about how to master loud, I took a mix that had been submitted to me by the original artist. It was a drum and bass song. And the mix itself was sitting at around -14. I completely re-engineered the mix, and the master of that original mix, I think, was sitting at around -9 LUFS integrated in the drops, and I pushed it to -6. And the -6 LUFS version, because I was using all of these techniques, sounds completely clean compared to other songs in the genre, cleaner in a lot of cases, I think. But I didn't push it to -4. Because I felt like at that point, and that's where a lot of the songs in the genre are, I didn't push it to -4 because I started listening to it and I'm like, yeah, to me, I'm like, if you match those and you take a -4 LUFS version and you turn it down by 2 dB and then you listen to it against the -6 LUFS version at 0 gain, just normal gain, to me, I start to hear, you're starting to lose things in the -4 LUFS version. You're starting to hear, in particular, limiter artifacts. You're starting to hear the drum tails and the body of sounds really pump up after the initial transient impact. And I don't like that sound. I don't think it sounds good. It's a really fatiguing listening experience. And unfortunately, a lot of electronic music gets pushed into that category because people seem to just be overly obsessed with loudness, and they can't hear the nuance, I think. But a great example to look at is like, where do you thread the needle on this? Is the 2024 Grammy given for best electronic / dance recording. And that was given to Skrillex and Fred Again and Flodan, who for the song Rumble. And that track, to me, everybody go listen to that. Go listen to that in .wav if you can. Download it from Beatport or whatever. Breathtaking mix. And Skrillex didn't do that mix or master.
Do you know the loudness readings for that mix?
You better believe I do.
I thought you might.
I've studied that song inside and out. So first of all, it was mixed and mastered by my friend Luca Pratalesi from Studio DMI, who is, he's an inspiration for me. He's somebody who I've learned a lot of what I know from. And I think he's one of the best engineers on the planet, maybe the top engineer on the planet currently for that type of music. I love his approach. And it was mastered to about -6 LUFS integrated in the drops.
Perfect.
And it got a Grammy.
It does seem to be that -6 LUFS is that. And you're talking about integrated across the drop here. So just for anyone that's not aware, Can you just explain that?
Of course, yeah.
Please, thank you.
Because LUFS are just, first of all, they're not the be all and the end all of loudness. LUFS, RMS, all of these are attempts, and they are fallible attempts. They are inaccurate in some degree, way, shape, or form. Attempts at understanding how the human ear psychoacoustically perceives loudness. And I study acoustics heavily, as we've talked about before. And so I'm really keenly aware of like equal loudness contours and how those impact our perception of loudness and the balance of frequencies and things like that. But I think that so LUFS, first of all, is fallible. It's inaccurate, but it's the best thing we have kind of right now at this day and age. And it's integrated LUFS can be fooled by having a longer intro that's quieter, right? The integrated LUFS across the entire song, which is what Spotify is calculating, can be lower if you extend the intro or the breakdown or the outro by double. So what I do is I ignore the integrated loudness calculation, the LUFS calculation for the whole song, and I just loop a section of the loudest section, so the drop, if we're talking about drum and bass, or bass music or electronic music, or the chorus if you're talking about a pop song. And I loop that and I calculate the integrated LUFS using a LUFS meter in there. You could also look at short term, but I find short term it's calculated on a window, right? And it can fluctuate up and down quite a bit, even over an 8-bar drop. So I just try and find a section where, like, okay, this is the heaviest section of the song. I loop it and I look at the integrated LUFS calculation for that time period only, excluding anything else.
That's very smart. Yeah, the short term LUFS window is 3 seconds, and it's constantly moving and constantly updating. Generally, what I like to do is I use that to and try and hit around -6, and I give myself a bit of leeway either side. So plus minus 0.2 decibels either way. For example, if it goes to minus zero, if it goes to minus 5.8, I'm not too worried. I'm still in the ballpark. But I also see the approach of doing it integrated across the whole drop. That's nice as well. I think I'm going to give that a go. But it seems like from what we've discussed so far that once you get past -6 LUFS during the drop, during the loudest section of the track, we're getting into an area of diminishing returns. So rather than pushing it any louder, all you're starting to do is, you mentioned a few things like introducing pumping effects, bringing up the tails of the drums. And like you say, though, when you're listening to music, that takes out the transparency, takes out the dynamic range and the punch. So I can totally see how that becomes problematic. So for anyone who's watching and is, a little bit confused by this whole loudness conversation, what would be a nice, easy target for them to shoot for if they wanted to create a loud sounding, competitive master without introducing problems?
Yeah, totally. And that gets us into context is really important. So let's say the context here is you're an artist who's maybe mixing and mastering. You're doing the DIY approach. You're mixing and mastering your own music. You're trying to get signed to a label. You have a specific label in mind and you're submitting to that label. So what I do is I go and I take a look at that label's most recent releases. And you need to understand how to assess those for how loud those are. So you either need to go and download those songs as WAV files from Beatport and throw them in your DAW and loop up the choruses or the drops, not the whole song, and calculate integrated LUFS to see how loud the heaviest sections of the song are being pushed. Okay, now let's say maybe you don't have access to those songs as downloaded WAV files. Another hack and way to do it is in Spotify or in Apple Music, you can turn off loudness normalization. So Spotify is not going to be turning down louder songs anymore. And I do this in Spotify. In the settings, basically all music is delivered to the Spotify app as it was originally mastered. Now it's been encoded into a lossy compressed format, so you'll have a bit of change from the original master, which is why I suggest getting WAV files, but it's going to be pretty close. So you go to the Spotify preferences, you turn off loudness normalization, and then you sample it out of Spotify. And you can just do that by using a routing app like VB Cable or Loopback or whatever, and route the audio from Spotify at full volume with loudness normalization off into your DAW. And then you calculate and you take a look at how loud are the loudest sections of the label's most recent releases. And that's going to give you a benchmark for what they're going to be listening to back to back with your song when you submit it to the A&R. And I would try and shoot for roughly in that range. You don't necessarily need to match it exactly. But the thing is let's say you're submitting to Hospital Records, drum and bass label, and the average song on Hospital Records is going to be -4 LUFS. I've hundreds and hundreds of drum and bass references, and I look at them all the time, and many of them are from Hospital. Now, if you're a producer who's been doing this for under 10 years and you haven't really deeply studied mixing and mastering, and you don't have this specific tool set of plugins and techniques that I'm talking about, which are very kind of niche. I don't see this knowledge really being talked about, these techniques. And there's a lot of them. If you're not doing that stuff, you won't even be able to get your mix to -10 LUFS and have it sound clean. But if you know all this stuff and you're an advanced engineer, or you get somebody like Luca Pratolesi to mix your song and create the potential for loudness, then yes, it could go that realm. So yeah, it's so situation specific, but I like the approach of taking a look at what other releases on that label are mastered to, and no need to overshoot that, but you probably want to get pretty close to that if you can.
Great. Instrumentation and arrangement plays a big part in that as well. Like you said, kind of going between a drum and bass track versus a vocal and just a piano. an Adele song doesn't have to be as loud as a Skrillex track. So, yeah.
You got it. Yeah.
Coming to the conversation of, people that do optimize for streaming and master tracks to adhere with the Spotify specifications. So we've got -14 LUFS integrated that they suggest with 1 decibel true peak of headroom. They also have a loud setting, I believe, as well, which is something like -11 LUFS and 2 decibels of headroom. So what would you say for people that are looking to optimize their music for streaming?
Yeah, totally. If that's the only place that your music is going to be heard ever, and you're not concerned about people that are downloading WAV files and DJ play and lossless stuff, then you could probably more closely adhere to the loudness standards of the platform. But I still don't recommend going for the low level of loudness that Spotify and Apple Music typically recommend, usually around the -14 LUFS mark, or even -11 is pretty compressed. So there's two big things to consider there. One of them is that loudness has a sound. And so what's happening as you push a song louder and louder and louder? Well, yes, you're containing dynamic range. You're lowering, you're raising the low level material up so it's closer to the peak level material. And having an infinite amount of crest factor or headroom, although some audiophiles might lead you to believe that that's always going to sound better, it doesn't. Like there's when talking about crest factor, and that's just crest factor has a lot of different names. Peak to loudness ratio, peak to short term ratio, all of that stuff. But basically, it's just that for people, I know you know this, Tom, but for the people who might not be familiar with this, it's the amount of distance between dynamic range between the loudest peaks, which are very short drum transients usually, and the body or the RMS of the signal. And a lot of people would try and lead you to believe, the purists out there would lead you to believe that more is always better. And that's also completely bogus. It's not true. If you listen to a song that has huge crest factor, 24 dB crest factor, it's going to sound wimpy and weird and thin. And so as you go louder and louder and louder, you're taking the low level material, the reverbs, the drum tails, the decays of different types of instruments, and you're bringing it up and up and up and up and closer and closer and closer. And if you go to -4, -2 LUFS, it's going to look and sound like a tube of toothpaste, and it's also going to be rubbish. So there's this Goldilocks zone of how loud as part of the sound is good. And what happens is as you increase loudness, the sounds, because the distance between the quiet sounds and the loud sounds gets smaller and smaller, you end up getting this sound of a lot of engineers call it containment. It sounds very contained, and that can be desirable. So in electronic music specifically, having this sound of being contained and having low level material quite close to high level material can be really an integral and key part of the sound. So there's that to really consider as well. And I think that's all. How much crest factor do you actually need, and is containment part of the sound? So to loop back to the beginning part of your question, with Spotify and things like that, if you're just going for DSPs, I would say stop looking at loudness meters altogether. And most of the best engineers that I interview and talk to, they're not looking at loudness meters while they're working. They might reference it at the very end of their process, but they're listening for those things that you talked about earlier, Tom. You're listening for pumping, you're listening for distortion, you're listening for dulled transients, you're listening for aliasing distortion. Those are the hallmarks of garbage loudness. When you've pushed things too far, you've overcooked the mix. And also, like you said earlier, if you're going above, if you're going into that range of -4, -3, -2, invariably you get to a point where you have to sacrifice bass, right? Mm-hmm. Bass takes up the most energy. Sub-frequencies take up the most energy of the whole frequency spectrum. And if you're pushing for loudness just for loudness's sake, and it's an ego thing for you, and I made a -2 LUFS, dubstep track, it's going to sound rubbish. I've never once heard one that didn't sound rubbish. I dare anyone, send me a -2 LUFS song and I will listen to it. I change my mind. I am willing to be proven wrong. I will look at the data and I will eat my words, but I've never seen it. And I've looked at a lot of
And you've been looking. Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Yeah. And I know you've been looking too, because we both,
Yeah.
we're both data driven guys. So
As well, I think when you're going back to what you said a moment ago about not looking at any meters, I think that this is possible when you have your headphones or speakers configured to a point where you know what the right loudness is going to be. So that kind of gives a bit of context as to why a lot of pro engineers are doing that. And that can, but if you don't have those things set up, it can be just an impossible challenge, because this is what I do personally. Is as I'll have my headphones and my speakers set up to the loudness that I know. Once everything is in the correct position, and the right loudness that I need for the client, whatever that is, whether they do want to optimize for streaming or whether they want to optimize it for loud club play, I know it's coming through at the loudness that's going to feel right to me, and I've heard it a million times. So that can be
yeah,
really useful. So setting up your system to the point where all of the other reference tracks are sounding where they, not too loud, not too quiet. Because again, what we said earlier about the differences in loudness and how we perceive the audio to have more clarity in the high frequencies and more richness in the low end, and just to sound and feel better. That is also the case when you're monitoring your mix and working on the master itself.
100%.
Yeah.
And that
So
brings up sorry, go ahead, finish your question.
I was going to go back to, so to conclude what we were just talking about in terms of should we master to minus 14 LUFS for streaming sites? Really, it comes down to from how you answered, it comes down to the crest factor of the audio, the dynamic range, and how you use the word contained. Other people might use the word glue. Is that a comparable kind of thing that we're talking about here in terms of, how everything comes together, looking at the dynamic range and serving the music in a way that suits it best, and not going past that and not underserving it at the same time?
Yeah, exactly. There's a Goldilocks zone to be had there, and in some cases it takes quite trained ears to be able to hear that. I think for me, I've made a lot of mistakes in this area. I'm not sitting up here on a high horse saying that I nail this stuff all the time. Like
From day one.
I've been
Yeah.
in this, I started writing music and getting into electronic music production in the year 2000. So it's been nearly 25 years, right? So, and I only really got into
Wow.
mixing professionally in the last 10. And prior to that, I was making all kinds of mistakes. And I just didn't really have the trained ears. And in some cases, the room, because I'm working in a control room right now that has incredible acoustics. It's easier to hear stuff in here. But even back then, I just don't think my ears were trained on listening for the types of artifacts that we're talking about. I hadn't trained them intentionally on how to listen for that stuff. So I would push things loud and it would sound okay to me. And I wouldn't understand why some people were like, yeah, you overcooked that or whatever, right?
It is a challenge. It's a challenge. So just to kind of quantify that Goldilocks zone for people that might just be starting out, what would you say is a great range for them to say, aim for this as a good starting point? Let's say, like, as loud as you want to go without introducing issues, and as quiet as you want to go without it being too quiet.
Yeah. And this is where referencing really comes in. We are really, really good at comparing, even if you don't have super well-trained ears. And this is actually one of the critical ways of training your ears is we're not good at listening to something in isolation and being like, unless you're like a multi-decade, engineer with a, that has calibrated the monitoring system and you just know there's a feel to it, like you get that on your system, right? You've dialed your ears that way. But we're not really good at listening to stuff in isolation and making an objective judgment about it. We need comparison points. And so that's where referencing really comes in. So what I would say to do is everybody, novices and experienced producers and engineers, all have a pool of music that this is my jam. These are my favorite songs. Not only is the song writing, the arrangement really good, and you like the vibe of the tune, but the engineering on it is something that you really think is breathtaking. And for me, that's why I mentioned Luca's work, because the stuff that he works on with Skrillex and Diplo, I think that those are some of my references that I use as comparison points to what's been done really well. And so you need to load up something that several songs that in the genre that are as similar in style as possible to what you're writing, and listen back and forth to yours. And don't just use the meters and the tools, but really listen to them. And if where your song is starting off is like you're kind of just beginning the mastering process, you don't know too much about mastering, and maybe yours is sitting at like -10 LUFS, then that's kind of where you think it sounds good. And you're using a reference that's -6 LUFS, like one of these Skrillex songs, turn it down by 4 dB. Turn the louder song down by 4 dB. And of course, Tom, you have tools that will help people do that. That's one of the amazing things you do at your company is do an equal loudness comparison using reference and get an apples to apples comparison and listen for those quality differences. And maybe you have room to move your song up and experiment and see what happens when you push your master now to -8. And don't do it just to push loudness, but do it and compare loudness normalize them yourself and listen back to back and start to hear when your song breaks apart or when it starts to sound too compressed, when maybe you listen to the -14 LUFS version and that is the version that sounds best to you. And that's great. And if so, I've never had that happen to me. It's always the -11, -10, even on singer-songwriter stuff that sound a bit right to me. But you have to make your own judgment on that, but you have to do it in a way that you're not fooling your ears with loudness.
Yeah. So let me give you a scenario. Let's say someone's working on a electronic track. Let's call it a house track. And it's sitting at -8 LUFS during the drop right now. And so let's say there's another 2 decibels of potential in that genre without too much hassle, but it's just falling apart. There's distortion. It just sounds groggy when you start pushing the limiter any further than that. So what might be holding back the master from going louder than -8 LUFS in that person's mix? How could they alleviate that problem and push the master louder to -6 LUFS so it could be more competitive when they upload it to the labels?
Yeah, totally. This is like masterclass level territory that I could talk about for like a week long, all day long, pretty much. So I'll just hit on some of the big ones. One of the biggest ones is when you have material that's summing together. So, and especially, so it's always going to be your low frequency range first. That's going to be the biggest culprit. When you look at a sine wave, right, that goes like this, all that energy, all that volume that's underneath the sine wave is energy, right? And so bass waves have a lot more energy than if you look at a fast waveform that's doing this, that little tiny shaded area in there, I'm just drawing with my finger, but you know, you kind of get what I mean, is a lower amount of energy. And so you always have to take a look at frequencies from the bottom up first. And this gets you into like, this is no surprise, kick and bass, snare and bass. And so you have to take a look at how that stuff is summing together. And are you nipping and tucking that in such a way that you're not getting overloads? And so a lot of people you have been told to use sidechain compression. I don't, and nobody I know uses sidechain compression for stuff like this. It's just not the right tool for the job. We have way better tools that are way more surgical. I use enveloping tools to be able to do that. And so they allow me to draw in a very surgical envelope triggered by the incoming drum with look ahead that sees the drum coming. And so I've reduced the amplitude of the sub, at least, if not the entire bass, if it's a mid-rangey bass, to digital 0 when the drum transient comes in. So you have completely cleared headroom for the transient of that drum. And you need look ahead to be able to do that, because if you have a sidechain compressor and it has an attack time, it's going to leave a bit of bleed in there right when the transient of the drum comes in, and you're going to get a big summing spike. So that's one of the big things, is you need to use very specific tools. And there's a couple of them out there. I use Devious Machines Duck is the tool that I use. It has an audio sidechain with look ahead that allows me to do that. It's very surgical, and I draw in a different envelope for my kick and for my snare using an overlaid oscilloscope. So it's a very hyper scientific technical process to get this finessed so that it doesn't sound like it's stepping on the bass too much, and the bass is like moving out of the way. You need to avoid what they call bow tying, right? Which is the bass being attenuated too long and not springing up fast enough as the drum decays. You kind of want like an even fade out of the drum and the bass coming up at the same point, so you don't get a dip in the middle. That's called bow tying.
Mm-hmm.
And so I set up these plugins in such a way that I minimize or I eliminate bow tying. That's just the bass, though. I also, in my workflow, am routing everything else that I want out of the way of the drums into a ducking submix or busing structure. And so I'm taking everything except usually vocals, because we want vocals to not be ducked to the drums typically. And I'm routing like all of my returns. So all the reverbs, all the delays, all the return, send and return effects that might have long splashy tails, those are all getting ducked to the kick and the snare. So that's one of the big things. And then the other thing that can be a really common culprit in preventing you from getting clean loudness is peak level and letting these little stray peaks, summing points, accumulate all the way up to your mix, and then you think that you're going to deal with them in mastering. And so this was the subject of my how to master loud video, rather, and has a big -6 LUFS on the video thumbnail. It was looking at what happens in a typical exported mix and seeing all these little spikes, and they're not spikes on every kick drum or every snare. These are just every 3 or 4 bars, or sometimes every 7 or 8 bars, you see this spike in peak level that's above the average peak level. And it's these little spurious spikes in peak. And they happen a lot of times because of drums. Yes, they happen because of things that are audio material that's summing together. It could be one particular vocal syllable is a little loud. And it basically comes from the mixing process and not looking at and analyzing and attending to these spikes in peak level during the mixing process, ensuring that your master has a very nice kind of even level of sample peak level on these transients. So I have videos that I did on this. One is called Micro Transients, the Assassins of Loudness. It's a YouTube short that's less than a minute. I have the video called How to Master Loud, which is about this. And then I have a recent video I did on I do this before mastering, which is showing an Isotope RX cleanup process that I do. All of those things are oriented around dealing with these little micro transients that are a couple of samples to a couple of milliseconds only. These are not drum transients that you hear. There's these little micro spikes. But the main thing that you do and you can do in the mix is using clipping. And for years and years, I thought clipping was something to be avoided. I thought that clipping was bad until I started paying attention to engineers like David Nazi from Mixbus TV and Luca Pratalesi, and watching what they were doing with clippers. And the fact, and after that, I started realizing, I can be, if I'm mixing loud and I'm going for a competitively loud song in like an electronic music dance genre, I really need to be assessing every individual sound and clipping micro transients off of it in a way that is done very transparently. And that's been like the biggest game changer in my mixing and mastering workflow that's allowed me to get songs that are pushed beyond where they would normally break apart and have it still sound clean and high quality and high fidelity.
So prior to using the clippers, were those stray peaks pushing your existing limiter settings to too much? And when you shave those off, it just allows it to work a little bit easier in a sense. So you can achieve those louder sounds without introducing the distortion.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, let's say you're dealing with an acoustic snare performance, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're not going to have even spikes in drum level. There's going to be every once in a while, the drummer's going to hit that snare in a way that it's going to be 4, 5, 6 dB louder than the other snare peaks. Now, if you don't deal with that in the mix and you let that sum up to the master, now all of a sudden you have this peak in the master. And if a lot of people, what they do, this is, I think, the biggest mistake in DIY mastering, also in people that are doing their own mixes and sending it out to other people like you or me to master, is there's only one thing you can do with it at that point, which is hit it with a clipper on the master or hit it with a limiter on the master or both. And that's going to trigger an artifact in the limiter or the clipper that's going to distort the entire song, everything in the song. And you can't really hit it as hard to reduce that peak level using those tools on the master, because anything on the master is so obvious. Like, you have to be so careful on the master using effects like that, because as soon as you have a limiter dip a little bit, it's going to dip everything wideband, right?
Mm. I just want to touch on what you said a moment ago. You said that you wrongly thought that clippers were bad for your mix. What was your previous incorrect misconception about clippers? What did you think that they were doing to your mix, and how did you learn that that was not correct? For anyone that might be having similar doubts.
Totally. Well, first of it was that I didn't even know that clippers were a tool that were used in mixing. I thought that clipping, the context that I'd heard clipping was clipping your master output when you're working. And this was something that is really common with producers when they're working in a DAW, is they don't really take a look at any headroom in their project, and they're running their master into the red, which is giving you non-oversampled hard clipping. And that distorts when you're doing it more than a couple dB, and it's not just a little flicker here and there. You might be able to ignore that. But when you're working and your DAW's flickering into the red, you're getting non-oversampled hard clipping on your entire mix. And that produces square wave odd harmonics that make your sound a lot brighter. It totally changes the timbre of your mix in a way that makes it impossible for you to gauge whether you're setting a compressor or EQ or saturator correctly. So, correctly from other people, I'd heard that pushing into the red when you're mixing in a DAW is bad, and it is bad. I think anybody who does that, it's a huge oversight. And that's one of the big things that I've done in our videos with Warp Academy is I always make sure our trainers are not working in the red. We're leaving headroom in our projects, so you're hearing what you're supposed to be hearing. So I'd kind of heard it in that context where I was like, oh, clipping is bad, or clipping the input of some type of, it came a lot, I think, from the world of analog, clipping the input of some piece of analog hardware that caused artifacts or distortion in the analog chain. And that kind of, was deemed to be bad. Although analog clipping actually is something that can be really useful and good now that I have a better understanding of it. So it was really understanding and starting to see, I think I might've seen it on like Dave Pensato did a lineup of different clippers, and I was seeing him working with clippers in the mix, and he was, using like K-clip and stuff like that. And he was like intentionally clipping a kick drum. And I was like, oh, it was an epiphany for me seeing somebody who was an engineer like that. And I was like, oh, there's plugins that are intentionally clipping something. So clipping isn't bad. It's kind of part of a sound or part of a technique. And then I started to understand that saturation and soft clipping are actually very similar, and that distortion and hard clipping, and really understanding that I'd been using distortion and I'd been using saturation. So I had been using clipping. I just didn't know it. And that a clipper is a distortion device. That's what it is. A lot of people don't understand what the difference between a clipper and a limiter is, or a clipper and a compressor. Well, a clipper is a device that is intended to generate distortion, and in a very controlled way. And it can be very useful when that distortion is super short, like on a drum transient.
Wow, interesting. It's a lot to take on board, but it's all very useful stuff. So let's jump into something a bit different here. So I wanted to ask you about a process that you can recommend people that want to do either a test or demo master, setting something up quickly that they can send out to labels and anyone else that they want to present their music to.
Yeah, totally. So this is what we would call a demo master or a quick master. And I think it's useful to be able to, even if you're not going to be the one doing the final master, a lot of times when you get a piece of music signed to a label, they're going to have their own mastering engineer, or maybe you're even planning on sending it out and paying for a mastering engineer yourself. But there's this need to be able to do kind of a quick and dirty master. And same thing if you're somebody who wants to play your music in a DJ set. This would has applied to me many times before, and I just want to make a version of it that's loud enough for me to play in a DJ set, so I can go listen to it in the club or on the PA at a festival that I'm playing. And so it's nice to be able to do that yourself. And really, the only plugin that is necessary on a master is a brick wall limiter. That's the only single plugin that you have to have on your master. So it can be literally as simple. And this is really quick and dirty, is really rough, as just pushing your mix into a limiter, listening for all of the things that we talked about in terms of how loud can you go? Are you producing artifacts? And it needs to be a good limiter. Like I don't recommend using the built-in native limiter in a DAW. Usually for that type of stuff, they're usually not set up very well for that, although they can in some cases sound halfway decent. But yeah, using a good third party limiter plugin and pushing it up. But a lot of times when you start to do that, at least for me, this is where a big epiphany happened for me as a mixer. Is as soon as I started doing that, my mix that I thought sounded good all of a sudden started to seem flawed. And as soon as I started to push into a limiter a little bit, I'd be like, oh, I'd hear things that I then are like, that doesn't sound like the way I intended it in the mix. It sounds different. What's going on? And that got me curious about then using it as kind of a feedback loop to inform my mixing process. It kind of shone a spotlight on some of the flaws, and this came even a precursor to this was I didn't trust myself to master my own music. So I always was sending my music out to a mastering engineer, and every single time when I got the master back, the first draft, I wanted to change the mix. I just hear things that I was like, whoa, I can't believe how much that shifted in mastering. And it wasn't what the mastering engineer was doing. I was like, there's no way he turned down the snare by 6 dB. I was hearing the snare sound quieter in the mix because of something in the master rather than because of something I'd done in the mix. And luckily I was working with a mastering engineer at that point in time. This was Terkith, Eric Magrini from Inner Portal Studio. He's a great mastering engineer I've worked a lot with over the years. And luckily, he gave me rounds of, he could be like, okay, you change something in the mix, send it back to me, I'll run it through the chain again. And he gave me this kind of iterative process. And then eventually I realized I was like, I can be doing this on my own before I send this to Eric, even if I'm going to get him to master it still. And then I can get some of these little gremlins out of the mix before they go to him, and it's going to sound closer to what I want.
Interesting. So we'll call this is the stress test of putting the limiter on the mix itself and seeing how the mix will respond once we bring it up to this kind of target loudness that we've been discussing. And this is when the issues are going to arise and present themselves of any distortion or conflict between channels that you mentioned. So at what point in the mixing stage do you think that it's appropriate to introduce the limiter to kind of get an idea of what it might sound like later on down the line?
Totally. Yeah. So big point of clarification here is that you don't start with just mixing into a limiter. There's this mix it like a record philosophy of like, okay, you're going to have this mastering chain on your song. Eventually it's going to be at this commercially level of loudness. Why not just push your entire mix the whole way into the mastering chain? And I don't subscribe to that approach. So certainly not at the beginning. And I certainly do not, even once I start engaging a limiter, I certainly do not leave it on the entire mixing process from that point forwards. I just use it as a turn it on, turn it off, turn it on, turn it off as a frame of reference. So you want your mix kind of probably mostly together. You definitely want the production done. So you want to be, you're not just like putting the limiter on while you're choosing kicks and snares and recording a vocal. Like you don't want it on then. You want your mix kind of maybe at the 80% mark. You want it to be rough mixed. So I divide my mixing process into kind of two phases. There's rough mixing and then there's fine mixing. And so I get the mix roughed in, and then I'll slap the limiter on and off at that point. So it's like, levels are the mix is roughly leveled out. I might not have finessed all of the spatial effects. I might not be pushing things up and down by like the final dB or two to really get the mix in the pocket. But it's useful at that point to expose issues or flaws in the mix to put the limiter on at that point.
Okay. Moving on to more of a fine-tuning aspect of limiting itself, I want to talk about oversampling. So what actually happens when you engage oversampling on clippers and limiters when you're either mixing or mastering?
Yeah, totally. This was a huge aha for me because as I was being trained and I was listening to people that had more experience than me, in some cases even reading plugin manuals, I had always heard people describe oversampling as a way of increasing quality. And so earlier in my career, I would always turn oversampling on. But the problem, there's a variety of problems with oversampling. One of the issues with that, though, is that oversampling consumes a lot of CPU, right? Because it's upsampling things. So if you start turning oversampling on in your plugins, a lot of times I was finding that was causing an untenable CPU load. And so I was turning oversampling off. And then when I went to go render my final mix or my final master, I was just enabling oversampling at that point and then doing an offline render. Huge problem is that my results sounded different. I started noticing that first, that everything sounded different, not in a good way many times, to how I had heard it with oversampling off. And so this process of like leaving oversampling off to save CPU and then just ticking oversampling on across the board on all the plugins and rendering, huge mistake. There was a great interview between Nicholas DiLorenzo from Panorama Mixing and Mastering, it's another engineer I greatly respect, and Ian Stewart, who is one of the mastering engineers that is the mod behind Mastering Engineers Worldwide, the group on Facebook. He's a technical writer for Isotope, and he also runs Flowtown Mastering. And it was a conversation between these two very advanced engineers, and they talked about this exact thing. And Ian said, like, one of the biggest mistakes that people run into with oversampling is not understanding that oversampling changes the sound. It can dull transients, for example. And just turning oversampling on before rendering, huge mistake. And in some cases, plugins have an online and an offline setting. So like in K-Clip, for example, one of the clippers that I use, it has oversampling that you can set so you can use lower oversampling when you're playing and you need real-time audio processing. And it has an offline render oversampling setting. I don't even think plugins should have that at all, because it means you can never monitor the final signal. You have to render it and then listen to it. So we've established oversampling changes the sound. It doesn't necessarily equate to quality, and it doesn't change the sound always in a good way. So in the context of clippers, limiters, compressors, what oversampling is doing is it's allowing the detection of intersample peaks. So people would call these ISPs. Now, more recently, they're called true peaks or TPs. And they occur in the high frequencies most commonly. And it's allowing that detector to detect a higher peak level. And so if we use a good example, let's use the example of a clipper or a limiter. They're doing similar things in their reining in peak level. And that flipping oversampling on will definitely trigger more limiting or more clipping. And so that's one aspect of it. And the other piece of it is that, and this gets into something that's really nerdy, and it's any plugin that oversamples. It doesn't matter if it's a limiter or a clipper, it could be saturation, it could be an EQ, anything that oversamples has to be downsampled at the end of the plugin, right? So it's upsampled, the processing occurs. Usually the intent of that processing is to reduce aliasing and the reflection of higher order harmonics back into the audible range. So the plugin will upsample, and at some point it needs to be downsampled back to the project sample rate. And when it's downsampled, it has to use a low pass filter. That low pass filter is usually oriented somewhere close to Nyquist, right? And whenever you band limit a signal, that's what a low pass filter is doing. It's using a sync function and it's low passing. It's removing high frequencies. And whenever you remove high frequencies by band limiting a signal, you get overshoots. What do I mean by an overshoot? It's a higher peak level than before the downsampling process. Anytime you remove frequencies, and they can be these super, super high frequency, supersonic frequencies, as soon as you remove harmonics, Fourier partials in that range through band limiting the signal through an anti-aliasing low pass filter, you create a spike in level that wasn't there before the downsampling process. And I'm not talking about just effects on the master here. This is most significant actually when you're using oversampling on things like individual drum sounds. I tested a snare drum, and one I used a non-oversampled hard clipper. It just sheared off the top. It just looked like the top of a square wave, which was exactly what I wanted. Just nice, completely controlled hard sealing. And then I turned on oversampling in this clipper plugin, and you saw this spike of 3 decibels from turning on oversampling. Not only did it not sound better, it didn't sound any better. It engaged more clipping. It went from 4 dB of clipping to 5.4 dB of clipping, and then it created a 2.8 decibel overshoot, which completely eroded the reason why I was using the clipper in the first place.
And that can be problematic because if that snare didn't have less headroom, sorry, you need that extra headroom in the snare so that the limiter later on down the line doesn't have to work as hard, and everything combines together, and it pushes the product in the right direction when everything is under control.
You got it. So like, yeah, let's take that example of the snare. I had taken the snare, and snares are something that can take a lot of clipping and still sound good. So if you use a non-oversampled hard clipper and you clip a snare, the clipper is producing distortion on the transient of that snare. It's producing odd harmonics if it's a hard clipper, which sound like square wave. They're bright, and I like that. So, and any aliasing distortion foldback on the clipper is going into the transient, which is extremely transparent, if not completely indetectable. And it actually that distortion on the beginning of the snare is not something I'm trying to avoid. It adds to the perceived loudness of the signal. It's desirable, including the aliasing, because it's masked by the transient of the drum. So in that case, I want a hard ceiling. I want to just clip it. I am not worried about aliasing. I'm not worried about distortion. In fact, that's why I'm using the clipper, is to introduce that into the front of the drum. So I want that negative 4 dB ceiling. And as soon as I engage oversampling, I'm up to negative 1.8 or negative 0.8 or whatever it was on that drum. It increased peak level quite substantially, and you can see it in the audio waveform. Mm-hmm. And now imagine that we leave that. Now we're hitting our mastering limiter, and one drum has a negative 4 ceiling, and then the oversampled version has a negative 1.8 ceiling. Well, that extra 2.2 decibels of amplitude is going to hit the limiter. And you and I both know what happens to a limiter. Like 2.2 decibels into a mastering limiter, that's huge. That's the difference between a clean master and a distorted master. Right?
And this is, again, your reason why moving forward, you're not using any kind of oversampling or true peak limiting when you're mastering your tracks.
Yeah, well, true peak limiting is a slightly different subject, worthy of its own discussion. So we can hop into that. But on my clipping plugins and limiters, if I'm using limiters, I do sometimes use limiters instead of clippers if I want a cleaner signal. If I don't want that little burst of distortion like on drums. Yeah. If I'm using a clipper just to take off these little micro transients, then the amount of distortion that you hear from the clipper is really embedded into the transient and the perception of the loudness of the transient of the signal. So I'm not worried about controlling that or controlling the distortion or controlling even aliasing in that respect, because it's being completely masked by the transient. Transients, by their nature, are all the way loud as they can be, and they contain all frequencies. So they have a huge masking effect on any type of distortion that's embedded in the transient. You just can't hear it. Mm-hmm. So that's why hard clipping works really well on drums. But if I'm digging into the RMS of the signal with something, it could be a saturator or it could be a soft clipper, right? If I'm digging into the meat of a signal, the body of a signal, which means that it's not a millisecond or 2 or 3 millisecond burst of distortion, it's actually a sustained amount of distortion. At that point, I will use oversampling on the plugin. So when I'm using saturators and things like that, and I'm processing the body of signals, like I might use saturation on vocals, I might use saturation on guitars and like long basses, 808s. In that case, I will most certainly be using oversampling because I want to control aliasing in that respect. So yeah, that's kind of where I will use oversampling. So I'm not just anti-oversampling all the time. It's, you need to understand what oversampling is really doing, and it's not just tied to quality. Oversampling and quality are just not the same thing. They're just, oftentimes they're called quality, but really I think it involves a deeper understanding of what oversampling is actually doing. And because oversampling can cause the detection of higher peak level, this is why oversampling can also dull drum transients, because it causes more limiting. And that gets us into maybe getting into true peak limiting now.
So is true peak limiting something that you've left behind, or are there also use cases for that moving forward?
Yeah. So should we set the stage for people maybe who might not be familiar with what
Thing is, we've
true
been
peak
talking about
limiting is?
this. Yeah, we've been talking about this conversation privately for such a long time. Let's set some more context. You're right. So, if you could just give an overview on what true peak limiting is and how it affects music, that'd be great.
Sure. So, with sampling rates, let's talk about 44.1K, right? CD sampling rate. You have all these snapshots that are happening 44.1 thousand times per second, right? The thing is that you have frequencies that are happening where the frequency is actually happening in between these sampling snapshots. So if you take a look at a waveform and you really zoom in to a sample level, and you're looking at it as zoomed in as you can possibly zoom in, sometimes you see two sampling points. And imagine a sine wave going up and down that's a really fast sine wave. It's like, super high frequency. And you have your two sampling points. It's, you have this crest of the sine wave that actually just goes a little bit over the two sampling points. So that's what you call an ISP, or an intersample peak. That's the way what it was called, and you still hear people call them ISPs. But it's kind of the newer terminology, as they call it a TP, or a true peak. And so you'll see sometimes people referring to TPs, which just means true peaks, and you'll hear people using the terminology TPL, which means true peak limiting. And what the theory is, and this is theoretical, and things that are theoretical do not always translate into the real world. Okay, so this is the first aha moment I want people to have. The theory is that if you have a true peak or an intersample peak, that when that goes out, if it's not addressed, and that's in the master, and then it's played back in a certain environment, that it can cause distortion in the analog realm as it goes through the voltage rails of the the digital to analog converter, the DAC, and it gets played back on the system. Is that could actually create a little snippet of distortion. That's the theory. And so based on that theory, what people started to say is we need to prevent these horrendous true peak overs, and we need to prevent that distortion from ever happening. And so what they suggested doing is creating a TPL, or a true peak limiter. And what a true peak limiter is all it is oversampling. There's nothing different. It's just oversampling. And based on the ITU for a true peak limiter, it has to have a minimum of 4x oversampling. Some limiters like FabFilter Pro L2, you engage TPL, it's an 8x limiter. Now, some limiters, they all do it a bit differently, but in Pro L2, the way it works is it engages a second limiting stage. So you have your primary limiting stage, which is however you've set up your limiter, and then you hit TPL. That engages a limiter next in chain. You don't see it because it's hidden underneath the code, but it's an 8x oversampling limiter afterwards. Now, based on our conversation so far, there's a variety of reasons why we might say that that's not a good thing. First of all, is as soon as you engage TPL, it is detecting higher peak level, which means more limiting. Now, if you've set up your master and you're on the edge and you've really finessed things and it's sounding great, and you know that if you push your limiter much more, that it goes into artifacts, it goes into distortion. The last thing that you want is more limiting. You've set it on the edge, right? That's where you've set it. So a lot of artists, the big mistake they make is say, oh, Spotify tells us we need to have true peak limiting. So I set up my master, everything sounds good. They flip on TPL. TPL can sometimes engage 2 decibels or more of additional limiting. That's a huge difference. And now all of a sudden, your master's distorted. Why did we use TPL in the first place? Let's rewind. This is where the thought process breaks down for me. Why did we come up with TPL? Oh, to prevent distortion. And then we turn on TPL and it creates distortion. So I was on the Mastering Engineers Worldwide group on Facebook a while back, and this is a very discussed topic. It's a heavily discussed topic. And I really vibe with something. I forget who the engineer was that said it, but he said that I've never heard an ISP, but I always hear TPL. Let's unpack that statement because it's filled with terminology. So what that engineer was saying is I've never heard this theoretical distortion from a true peak over, from an ISP and intersample peak. I've never actually heard that. But when I engage TPL, true peak limiting, I always hear it. So if you're going to use true peak limiting, you should not dial your limiter in first and then engage TPL and ship it. That will create a recipe for disaster, which is baked in limiter artifacts and distortion into the master that you're going to hear no matter what, whether you're listening quiet, whether you're listening loud, everywhere you're going to hear that. So the best engineers that I know, the workflow that they use is they actually split it and they use two limiters. So they use their main limiter and then they use a second limiter. Sometimes it's a different limiter, and they engage TPL in that second limiter from the beginning of their mastering process. So it's set, and as they push the signal into that final stage, they're hearing any distortion. The other approach, so they can avoid the distortion that might happen from that additional limiting stage. The other way to do it is to use a single limiter, and you have TPL, and you either turn on TPL from the beginning so you can listen for the distortion that might happen and come to an acceptable level of limiting, or you can dial your limiter in and get it kind of on the edge where you're talking about, and then you engage TPL, and then you see how much additional limiting it's doing, and then you back off your limiter gain by that same amount. And so I first started studying this by talking to tech support at FabFilter and understanding what TPL was doing in their limiter. And what I did is I put two limiters back to back. I used two instances of Pro L2. I used one and I got it dialed in exactly how I wanted using no oversampling. And then I put a second Pro L2 instance and I just, nothing, gain at 0, everything just left at default. And all I did was turn on TPL. And I looked at how much additional limiting was happening. And that's where I had the aha moment of like, oh my God, what is this doing? Why are people using this? And so I realized, okay, now I need to back off my first limiter by 2-3 decibels so that I'm not getting that nasty effect of additional limiting. Or I need to just sacrifice loudness throughout my entire mastering process to the tune of 2, sometimes 3 decibels of loudness, which to me never made sense either if I'm trying to engineer clean, loud tracks in the genres that I work in, electronic music, bass music, hip hop, pop, where loudness matters.
It's such an interesting topic. Does this mean if I am looking to get a master sounding good at -6 LUFS, for example, like we discussed earlier, does it mean that if I turn true peak limiting off, I'll have an easier chance at achieving that loudness without issues?
100%. If you turn true peak limiting off, it will produce less limiting, and less limiting means cleaner masters. We all know that as soon as you want to use as little limiting as possible. And this actually maybe brings in a conversation around how much limiting is acceptable. And that's another huge misconception that I had when I was first starting to do this stuff and starting to make electronic dance music songs, that I was trying to get at the same level of loudness as on the labels that I was submitting to, the releases on the labels. And I was sometimes getting 6 decibels of gain reduction on a limiter or more. And that's just rubbish all around. As soon as you start doing that to a limiter, doesn't matter what limiter on the planet, I don't care what limiter it is, you start doing that to a limiter, you've messed up. You're doing garbage loudness. And this is why so many purist audiophiles out there say loudness, you don't go loud. Loudness always sounds bad. It's because there's so many people out there that are doing that. And so I try and avoid that at all costs. When I did my drum and bass track on the video and it was sitting at -6 LUFS in the drops, people go look at that video and I show you how much gain reduction I'm getting in my limiter. It's under 3 decibels max. It's usually sitting tickling at like 1 to 2 decibels of gain reduction on the limiter. That's because I've used clipping in my mix and I've used Isotope RX to manually bring in microtransients, and I've paid attention to that all through the mix. I don't need to slam things into a limiter. So the last thing I want is to engage true peak limiting and get another 2 decibels of limiting or more to control these theoretical true peaks. And the other thing is you need to make if deciding whether or not you want to use true peak limiting, render your own test masters and go and listen to it. If you hear distortion, go turn on true peak limiting, render it again, and listen to see if that's fixed the distortion. Listen on the transients. That's where the true peak overs are going to happen. It's going to happen in high frequency material, drum transients being the worst offenders. So render the master using true peak limiting on, go and take it to all of the listening environments that your listeners will typically be listening on: phones, laptops, car audio systems, Bluetooth speakers, headphones. Go listen. It's the DAC that it happens in. It's the digital audio, digital to analog converter that this happens in. And go and listen to see if you even hear any of these theoretical true peak distortion overs. I did this test myself thoroughly over and over again. I've never heard one. I've never heard. So why would I penalize my master using, like, if you use true peak limiting and you bash your limiter an extra 2 dB, or you need to back off the loudness, the limiter gain in the track by 2 dB to account for the true peak limiting, you're baking in distortion or baking in a less loud sounding master 100% of the time. And so maybe some people have said that in certain test cases they can hear and these true peak overs, but you also have to factor in the impact of masking. And the type of music that I'm working on is harmonically rich, very dense music, and it has a lot of saturation. It has a lot of distortion in it. And so if TP overs create a little bit of distortion on the front of the drum transient, which is where they're going to happen most likely, do you even hear that? And do you even hear that? If you do hear it, do you hear it as something bad? And this is the big conversation about clippers, and why I don't oversample clippers is because you get that little burst of distortion at the beginning of a drum transient. It actually can add to the perceived loudness of that drum. So regardless, I don't hear them, and I just have a policy with my masters. If I don't hear a problem, I don't try and fix it. Same thing with aliasing,
It's a great meritocracy with your music. I wanted to ask as well, when it comes to transcoding from high quality file formats to lower quality file formats, whether it's MP3 or Vorbis or anything like that, do you ever leave any kind of headroom under those scenarios? Or is that another case of the peaks that can be introduced when a high quality file format is transcoded to a lower quality file format? Those peaks are also inaudible, and therefore we shouldn't worry about them? Or do you think that a little bit of headroom should be left to accommodate those changes?
Gotcha. Yeah, that's a really good question and a really important consideration for a mastering engineer. So yeah, a lot of the work that I'm doing these days is also going to be heard. It's songs that are going to be heard on the DSPs, the streaming platforms, and I know that it's going to be compressed in terms of the data rate compression. So I know it's going to go to a lossy format. And for those of you who maybe might not be aware of this, when you compress an audio file, and I'm not talking about compression in terms of dynamic range, I'm talking about data rate compression, MP3, like you said, AAC encoding MP4, stuff like that, it increases level because the lossy compression adds amplitude. And so what Tom's talking about is he's talking about, do you account for that? And my answer is usually yes. Unless the primary purpose of the song is for DJ play and I can only submit one master. So in an ideal world, I could submit two masters. Let's say it's a song for DJ play. It's like a banger EDM track. I would engineer one master for the Beatport Wave, download sites that the DJs are going to play. And then I would engineer a different master with more margin for the DSP streaming sites. But if I have to just do one, then if the primary audience is going to be the streaming platform, I will definitely leave a margin on the limiter. So the way that I test that is I'll use one of two plugins. I'll either use Isotope Ozone, and I'll use the codec preview that allows you to, and I'll put it after the limiter, and then I'll put a metering plugin following that. And usually I use your plugin Levels, actually, Tom, because it has a sample peak level meter on it. And I'll run the codec simulation and see what that does to my peak level. And I will sometimes look at true peaks as well. And then if I need to, I reduce the output volume on the limiter plugin to account for that. So it could be, I think the largest margin that I've gone with is 1.5 dB And that was for SoundCloud, because SoundCloud was compressing it all the way down to 128 kilobit per second MP3. So it was a huge, the more compression, data rate compression, the higher the amplitude spike from the compression. So Nicholas DiLorenzo, I was talking with him, and he has a bit of a different approach. So he uses the codec preview as well, and then he runs it into a non-oversampled hard clipper, and he listens to see if it creates audible distortion. And if it doesn't, he doesn't really bother leaving much of a margin. But if it does, so he'll adjust it by ear, I think is how his process goes, if memory serves. But I usually just go based on the metering, and I take a look at how much extra amplitude that the lossy codec simulation has added, and then I back off the limiter ceiling margin or the output parameter. I'm not doing it in a way that engages. You have to be clear here, because in some limiters, when you reduce the ceiling, it actually engages more limiting. That's the way the Ableton limiter works. I don't like that. Whereas I'm like in FabFilter Pro L2, I'm talking about the output parameter that just takes the limited signal and just turns the volume of it down.
It's almost like a gain plugin in that
like a gain plugin, exactly. Yeah, you got it. Yeah, so I will do that. And especially I'll do that for stuff that is intended first for streaming sites. So like these masters that I've been doing and videotaping recently and putting on the YouTube channel that I've done for Angus Wilson, that stuff is never going to be played by a DJ on WAV, probably. It's all streaming stuff. So I've oriented the masters in that way, accounting for lossy compression, amplitude, noise gain.
It's really fascinating. So we've talked a lot today about loudness, about setting up a test master, and looking at oversampling and true peaks as well. Can we see if we can come to some kind of conclusive, very short, efficient approach that we can give someone on a plate that can take this and say, this is my actionable information moving forward? How can we summarize this conversation in a couple of sentences into actionable information that someone can use in their next production?
Yes, just get Tom to master all your music.
Easy.
No, yeah, because he'll do all this for you. But no, if you're going to take, and that is actually the benefit, all joking aside, that is the benefit in working with a mastering engineer. And so for years and years, I worked with, I had a mastering engineer on my team, and I sent my music out to him, and he just dealt with all that stuff, and I didn't even need to think about it. But if you're a DIYer, and you want to, especially if you want to be creating your own test masters or demo masters, then if we try and put this in a nutshell, and I have to say I'm horrible at short, I'm like the deep dive guy that has the long-winded answers. So to ask me to put something in a nutshell, I'm gonna take my best crack at this. Okay. It is pay attention to sample peak level and micro transients all the way through your production and mixing process, especially in your mixing process. Do not leave loudness and attending to peak level all up to the mastering stage. Okay, so it begins in the mix, it begins in your production. And if you're wanting to engineer music in a way that it has the potential for clean loudness, you're absolutely going to want to look into and begin using clippers. Primarily, you're probably going to want to start using non-oversampled hard clippers to clip micro transients, and then you'll want to explore using tools like soft clippers and saturators, but with oversampling on in the mix. Okay, so that addresses the mix portion of it. And then when you get to the master, you want to be doing as little limiting as possible, because anything that happens on the master is the most audible. Okay, so any EQ, saturation, compression, anything you do on the master, you need to be so careful. And that's a lot of times where people ruin their music, is by doing something too heavy-handed in the master. The biggest thing I think that people do in the master that causes problems is they push their limiter too hard, because they haven't spread the load over a variety of plugins in the mixing process. So once you get to the mastering stage, if your context is loud, if loudness matters to you, and it doesn't to everybody, then start with a clipper first in chain, because that cleans up the signal that's fed to the plugins downstream of that are gain sensitive. So I would explore doing a little bit of clipping, a couple dB maybe, not much. You don't want it to be super audible, and spreading the load between the clipper and your limiter. So I clip first in chain to clean up little stray peaks before they hit the rest of my mastering chain, and then your limiter is last in chain, and then limiter last in chain. Just consider whether you even need to be using oversampling or true peak limiting. And if you do, do so very judiciously, and understand that if you engage oversampling, there's only two reasons to engage oversampling in a limiter. One of them is that you are hearing aliasing distortion and you want to address it. And two is that you need to deal with true peak level force for like a streaming platform or something like that. So again, use your ears, listen to your music. Are you hearing aliasing? And in most cases, aliasing is actually not audible. It's being masked by the distortion saturation in the music itself. So that's one reason I don't use oversampling. And two is it'll engage the detection circuit to read a higher peak level, and it'll cause more limiting, which causes more damage to your master. So again, if you think that you need to deliver something with a true peak level of -1, we'll render it without true peak limiting on. Listen to it. Can you play it on all your playback systems? Can you hear a problem? If you don't hear a problem, is it something you need to fix?
Excellent.
How was that?
It was very good. And then a couple of things I just wanted to add, which would have been what you discussed in terms of loudness. So hitting around -6 LUFS short term or integrated across the drop is a good target if you're shooting for loud music. And if you're not, if you're more optimizing for streaming or doing different genres, coming down to say between -8 to -10 is also okay. But serve the music depending on the transients of the music. I think that more or less covers everything else that we spoke about, which was all very fascinating and useful. So Drew, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your information so freely. It's very generous and it's very much appreciated. I have enjoyed and learned so much from having our conversation. So I'm so grateful to you for sharing this with the Mastering the Mix community as well. And hopefully we can have another conversation again very soon. So thanks again. And for everyone, for anyone who's watching, go and check out Drew's stuff. So Warp Academy's YouTube is unbelievably valuable, and the website as well. So head over there, subscribe, consume as much as you can, and you'll thank me later.
Thanks so much, Tom. It's always a delightful way to kick off my day when I get to have a deep and detailed talk about what we do. You know, this is how our relationship started. You and I would just banter back and forth and talk about tips and tricks and what we're doing as two, colleagues in the industry. And I love it when we can achieve that and just have some fun talking about the tools we use and the processes that we use. And we always get a chance to learn from each other. I've learned a ton from you and your channel and your content as well, your blog posts that are so well written. And then when we can do that in a way that showcases some of what we're doing that can be helpful for other people, that's a win-win for me. So thanks everybody for watching, and thank you so much, Tom, for hosting me.
Thanks, Drew.